We didn't start the verses yet, right?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. So, we're picking up again on chapter 9. My version here is on the Chinese is page 28, but I'm sure that's not the right page. 29 on the English.
26,
Yeah.
27.
26, 27. Okay. I'm going to do something maybe a little bit different. I'm going to try to move through this more thematically rather than systematically. So maybe in two lectures, 2 classes, cover this whole section of verses, focusing on what I think are the major themes. If I ever hope to finish the Avatamsaka Sutra, which I doubt that I will, it means in terms of sharing it with you, I think I'll start to try to move along. That's a very interesting, along a little faster, but at the same time, hitting on key points or key themes here, rather than, and sometimes we pay a little more attention to translation too, as it jumps out, depending on what comes. Tonight, though, I want to see if we can do at least get into these first 2 verses. Again, we're having trouble with sound.
It's a little closer. Okay.
Is that a little, you won't know until you get back to your cockpit, huh? Is that a little better? Okay. 1, 2, 3, testing.
Yeah, we'll find out. We'll make adjustments.
Okay, so let's just read in Chinese slowly the first 2 verses, starting with Fo Yu. So, Fo Yu Shan Shan Fa Tong Da Wu You Deng Zhong Shang Bu Neng Liao Si Li Wei Kai Shi Wo Xing Wei Ceng You Wo Suo Yi Kong Ji Yun He Zhu Ru Lai Er De You Qi Shan. Roughly translated, if you're looking at the English, the Buddha has penetrated, this is the Tong, or penetrates the most profound dharmas. No one is his equal, no one can equal him. Living beings are not able to understand this, meaning the profound dharmas. And so in sequence, he explains it for them. And then the next verse that we read, the nature of the self, literally translated, does not exist, and that which belongs to the self is also empty and still. How then do all thus come ones attain their bodies? So I think the first part I want to get into here is this. Obviously, especially the first verse is a mention, an allusion to what we call upaya in Chinese. That's in Sanskrit. In Chinese, it's called fengbian. Different English translations as skill and means, or expedient means, or provisional expedients. Basically conveys the idea that something that is very difficult to understand or grasp is either broken down into pieces that build sequentially into an understanding, or often an analogy, a metaphor, an allegory, bridge is used to go from what we do understand and make sense to us to something that's a little bit beyond our reach. So the first part, it's saying, whatever a Buddha, and I would translate this as a Buddha rather than the Buddha. I've been doing this, I misdata consistently, so I'm going to just do that now in my text and put any Buddha, meaning also potentially any living being. That's why I'm opening this up. This is clearly the Avatamsaka's thrust, that all beings have the Buddha nature and all can become Buddhas. So it's not the Buddha only that's being talked about here. A Buddha has penetrated the most profound dharmas. These are the deep understandings, insights into the nature of reality. And this is not easily equaled. This is rare. It's a very difficult undertaking, and it's a very difficult accomplishment. Not so much because it's difficult intellectually, which is certainly the case, but it's difficult comprehensively. In other words, it's an embodied wisdom or embodied understanding that involves the physical, the mental, the emotional, the intellectual, the spiritual, and it is a direct comprehension, a direct seeing. So that's what penetrating means. Penetrating doesn't mean simply that you can abstractly or philosophically think you understand it or be able to explain a little bit. It has to do with an actual total transformation of a living being into a Buddha. And that transformation, when it's complete and whole, there is an understanding that is direct, immediate, and profound. And no one, meaning all living beings, do not equal this. All Buddhas equal this. Bodhisattvas on various stages equal this. And that's why the third line says living beings, ordinary sentient beings who are not cultivating or who haven't cultivated to this degree of purification and stillness of mind and body don't understand this. It's very interesting because it's talking about a cultivated state of being that understands this. Very different than ordinary ways of studying either mathematics or science, where we really try to think it through, try to break it down into its components, or philosophically tie one principle to another using logic and reason. None of these are what this is talking about. But even though, you could say these first three lines, Buddha's penetrated the most profound, no one can equal them, living beings can't understand it. This is all describing the basically wisdom, but that fourth line is compassion. The fourth line is compassion. So in sequence, he explains, it doesn't have to be there. You could have those first three lines as being a statement, the Buddha's profound, living beings can't get it, so case closed. But in this case, something about the nature of this understanding leads to this compassion. And so in sequence it says, he explains it for them. And I think here we get at the heart of upaya. It is a cultivated compassion that causes Buddhas to skillfully lead others to the Buddha's wisdom. I am quoting there from the Lotus Sutra. Upaya is a cultivated compassion causing Buddhas to skillfully lead others to the Buddha's wisdom. And so it's a step-by-step process. In psychology, this is sometimes called shaping, S-H-A-P-I-N-G. It's a process of reinforcing successively closer and closer approximations to a desired behavior, end behavior. This is called shaping. And it can start at an early age. For example, a child first learns to pull himself or herself up, okay, and then after a little bit of that, the child's encouraged or self-motivated to stand and to try the first few steps. And after the first few steps, it's always a little setback. The child crawls around again, but stands up, really wants to do this. The parents are encouraging the child to. Child sees other kids doing this and wants to imitate, and finally able to run. and make steps, although there's some falls and whatnot, and then leap and dance and the whole thing, and doing marvelous things with the human body. Martial arts, ballet, all kinds of movements, Olympic performances, and so forth. But it starts, the shaping process, it begins with just basically pulling oneself from a crawl position. So this is the idea of shaping. Now, by this analogy I'm giving, I'm using a psychological term. The text doesn't call it shaping, it calls it upaya. But upaya is the same thing, where the Buddha takes this profound understanding he's reached upon his awakening and then says, how am I going to convey this? Because it's full of liberated joy and understanding and just the fullness of being. I really want to share this. I can see that others have this potential. And I know how I got here, but how can I lead people, other beings along? Because according to the text, this was not a one-time journey for a Buddha. It occurs over lifetimes. It's an accumulative process. Bodhi accumulates. And so one of the powers we mentioned last week was to know where these paths come from, where they lead, knowing his past lives and the events. So the Buddha, upon this, sees all the steps, and then skillfully, according to each living being's potential, sets up a shaping, sequential mechanism as a teacher. I'll give you an example from my own experience. When I was, before encountered Buddhism, I was working in a residential treatment center for severely emotionally disturbed children in the Central Valley of California, Modesto. And one of the children we got was a little boy named Stevie. He was about 3.5 years old, going on 4. Stevie had been abandoned by his parents and was living in a cardboard box in a field with his 7-year-old sister as his caretaker. This is a pretty dire situation. You've got a 3.5-year-old child living in a cardboard box in a field out in the Central Valley with no parents. They were scavenging for food and water. She didn't know much about taking care of a child, but she was keeping him alive. So when we got him, he was a real difficult case. He was basically, sort of like you would say, enfant sauvage. He was, an untrained, uncivilized, close to animal almost. And it took a lot of work to bring him along, but one of the things we were working on, for example, he never washed himself. He had never washed himself and didn't know what that was, and was very resistant to this. So we had started to get him to wash his fingers before dinner, kind of sit with him, put water and soap on his fingers, and he would resist it, but as he did it, we praised him. Oh, look at that, how nice your skin looks, and look at all the dirt go down the drain, and isn't soap fun? We make bubbles. And so eventually then you get him, after that reinforcement shaping that, you get him to wash his arms too. You get him to use a face cloth to wash his face, gradually, and reinforcing this all along, like this is wonderful. Now you're really a good boy. You're growing up. You're like the other kids. See how they come to the dinner table washed and whatnot, and the kids would praise, "Oh, Stevie, you look so good tonight," and then he'd feel good. Eventually, got him to do that. Then his ears, then washing his hair. Finally, I remember the first time get him into a bathtub. That was a real accomplishment. And show him how to wash himself. And then we went to the teeth and toothbrush and brushing the teeth. And over a process of time, about 6 months to a year, we got him from totally covered in dirt and not having any inclination or understanding what it was to take care of himself, up to taking a bath or a shower even every day, enjoying it, brushing his teeth and taking care of himself and so forth. This is shaping. So you're going from reinforcing successively closer and closer approximations to this desired goal. And that's what meant by sequence. So it's opening up and explaining and making clear all these various dharmas for living beings. For example, you might start with, you're going to feel better about yourself and people are going to feel better about you if you start paying attention to your ethical conduct, your moral behavior. If you treat people like brothers and sisters, not as objects of your desire or things to manipulate or to harm or to get your way and so forth, and from that precepting, from that calming of the moral nature, the possibility to begin contemplative practice of meditations and bowing, and even memorization of text can come because the conscience is clear and settled. And this is a shaping process, and eventually that leads to insights into wisdom. Those insights into wisdom will come back and reinforce the understanding of precepts, and this starts to accumulate. The Buddha might use different techniques here if someone was really stingy and possessive, would encourage and reinforce and extol and reward even generosity, giving for that person. Another person who is really scattered, couldn't focus, might be taught various methods of meditation, memorization, and so forth. Lazy, and encourage vigor and so forth. So these are all Dharma doors to shape. There's actually a word for this also in the Pali called pariyaya, which means roundabout or way around. It's very closely related to upaya, but pariyaya is referring to the metaphor, the simile, the parables. It means the indirect route. And much of the teaching of the Buddha, at least recorded in the sutras and text, concerns sermons and discourses mainly delivered in this pariyaya mode. We don't want to use the word circumlocution. Sometimes people use that because that kind of indicates a kind of evasiveness, beating around the bush. It's not beating around the bush to evade, but it's going around something in order to get at it better, to circle it a little bit so you see it and then you can enter it more deeply. So it's metaphor, it's allegory. Some of the jatakas you would put into the pariyata category, parables, anything that's not to be taken literally, but as a finger pointing to something else. It's like, for example, it resembles, let me give you an analogy, and so on and so forth. And this is very closely linked to the skill and means of upaya. Upaya, sometimes called upaya kayasaya, is now kind of a technical term in Buddhism. And some people point out that it isn't necessarily found in the Pali text, it's in the Mahayana text, but pariyaya is referred. But what it stands for is found through all the text. Okay, so maybe the term isn't exactly used, but what it stands for, this roundabout use of allegory, metaphor, indirect explanations, you find in all of them. And this is generally referring to, I wouldn't say it's a power necessarily, but it is skill approaching a power manifested in this awakened being, an ability to adapt what he or she says to the audience, to their prejudices, to their expectations, their capacities, their resistances. And it's a very skillful technique. If used rightly, it liberates. If used wrongly, it manipulates. And this is not about manipulation. It's not saying what people like to hear because it makes them feel good, but it's skillfully giving them something that they need to hear in ways that they can accept and use. And this is very different than just pleasing people. So let me quote you this. This is from the Lotus Sutra. I'm going to read you this passage here about, according to the Lotus, and this is in chapter 2 of the Lotus. And basically, it's the Buddha's talking. And this was upon his great enlightenment. He feels great compassion. This is very interesting. Upon his enlightenment, he feels great compassion for all sentient beings. And it says he's walking about during those 21 days upon his awakening, walking around by the Bodhi tree, just pondering, I guess, what he attained, but also living beings. And he was thinking, and this is a quote, "The wisdom I have attained is subtle and supreme, but the faculties of sentient beings are dull. They are attached to pleasures and blinded by delusion. How can I save such beings?" Now, this "how can I save such beings" could be, how, it's impossible. Or it could be, how can I? And then Brahma and his Devaputras, Shakra, the world protectors of the four quarters, Maheshvara and all the other devas, together with a retinue of hundreds of thousands of myriad attendants, paid their respects and palms together, begged me to turn the wheel of Dharma. So he was hesitant to teach, although he was motivated to teach, but he said, what I've attained is not just an intellectual apprehension. They're blinded by delusion and attached to pleasures. Basically, attachment and wrong thinking, these two issues. So this is very systemic. It's not just a kind of misunderstanding that he's dealing with. How can I possibly get them to see through those delusions, which are very strong? These go into habitual tendencies that are deeply rooted. And how can I get them to give up the pleasures that are driven by craving and thirst, which is driven by avidya and fear and anxiety? This is like really deep human stuff here. And maybe he just said to himself, I don't know, I don't think I can do it. But again, the devas come and beg him to do this. And then the Buddha reflects, if I only praise the Buddha vehicle, those beings who are submerged in suffering will not believe this Dharma. If I just come out straight and say, this is the Buddha vehicle, this is what all Buddhas understand, it's way too remote. It's in terms of where living beings are, it's just impossible for them even to imagine, much less aspire to or strive for. And that will cause them to reject and not believe the Dharma. They will fall into troubled states of being. I would rather not teach and instead immediately enter nirvana. And here's the line. But then I thought of the power of skillful means practiced by past Buddhas. So part of his understanding, sort of in his repertoire now of his wisdom, was this recollection that Buddhas of the past had this power of skillful means. This path that I've attained should now also be taught as three different vehicles. When taught the thus way, the Buddhas of the 10 directions appeared and praised him. Good indeed, that you have rediscovered this and on your way. So I just wanted to share that passage because it indicates the arising of this upaya, both from wisdom, but also from a profound sense of compassion, of being one with all living beings and wanting to share this. We could look at the next passage of why is this difficult to understand? Because the Lotus Sutra goes into this. It's very difficult to understand, very difficult to comprehend, not easy. And when we were discussing this class, it's like, what about it that's not easy? Why is it so hard to understand? And it has to do basically with a really deep fundamental one, which is the first line here. This nature of the self does not exist. And that which belongs to the self is also empty and still. This, all Buddhas awaken to the truth of anatta. This is from the Avatamsaka. All Buddhas awaken to this truth, this not self truth. By contrast, the very definition of a living being is someone who does not awaken to that, does not understand that, does not even have a glimpse of that, who's very attached to the notion of a permanent self. This is the gap. And all the behaviors of living beings evolve around me and mine. And all the behaviors of sages and bodhisattvas are liberated from that constraint. But the gap is immense, because the habit energy that's associated with that attachment is so deep and so strong. It's almost like people feel it's their very breath and heartbeat to be attached, to be seeking, to be grabbing in this way. And so this is the problem. I think the answer to the why it's so difficult is because to get from that to the letting go requires incredible skill and means that the Buddhas employ. The Lotus Sutra goes on and said, what the Buddhas attain is foremost, unique, hard to perceive, and difficult to understand. And what it is, the Lotus says the same thing. The essential nature of all dharmas, non-self and non-dual. But what's interesting is, and this is where the Lotus, I think, is very subtle, not only are they not able, there is a very strong intimation that they're not willing. So this makes it even more difficult. To say someone is unable to get into this is one thing. To say they're unwilling indicates a stubbornness, a buy-in, an attachment that resist teaching, resist explanation, resist instruction. And that's why the Lotus Sutra starts with one of the demarkers of the group that stays to study as opposed to the group that walks out, knowing that there's something further to learn along these lines, is the willingness to understand. That's a quote from the text. The willingness to understand. Once that willingness is there, over half the difficulty is over. But without that willingness, it doesn't matter. You can pour water on this rock, it's never going to go in. So this docility or this willingness or this openness of heart really is at the heart of this cultivation. The Buddha can show all this compassion and want to do that. But unless there's a corresponding reciprocity of willingness, openness, almost a tenderness, if you will, a vulnerability, there's no connection. Where does this willingness come from? It's a good question. It's a very good question. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion. I think about it. Just being beaten down with the frustrations and emptiness of the unexamined life. Frustration after frustration, always never getting what you seek, never being where you want to be. Sickness, aging, illness, death, everywhere you go, constant impermanence. Being close to those and that which you don't like, you even hate. Not just those and people, but that. Countries, societies, jobs. These are called the sufferings, all these various sufferings. And after a while, willingness comes not because at an early time you just say, oh yeah, I think I want to explore the Dharma. But it often comes because you pushed yourself in all these avenues that end up suffering. In other words, incompleteness, dissatisfaction, not delivering. And finally, you ask, isn't there something else? Is there no way to get away from this? So it could be that. For some people, it could be just a joyful, buoyant, almost childlike curiosity to know. And that leads to a willingness. I really want to know. When a child, for example, comes to school, I remember my undergraduate years when I went to the university, I was so excited. I so wanted to learn. There was so much I didn't know and I'd never studied before. I was almost willing to go nights without sleep to read and study and listen to my teachers. And the first time that I entered this world of ideas, the world of the mind, that willingness, it wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't fear of suffering, it was just the wanting to know, to expand my mind and my knowledge and my experience. So sometimes this willingness can be manifest as that insatiable desire, curiosity, in a positive sense, to know. Or it could be the exhaustion from the frustration of endless disappointment with seeing things as conditioned, fleeting, passing, impermanent, and not delivering. Or it could be some combination. Yeah. You're going to ask a question? Go ahead.
I was going to say, what about affinities?
What about affinities?
Yeah, like...
What do you mean?
Like you feel drawn, you're not really sure why, but there's just something that kind of is pulling you in, and you know, it's not that you're dissatisfied with life, it's not that you're overly eager to find something super mundane, but you're just being pulled.
Where would you place that? You're saying it's not exhausted suffering that leads, but it's not quite this thirst for knowledge and wisdom. But affinities would be somewhere leaning towards a second, though, wouldn't it? It's a positive thing. Affinities are usually negative or positive. When they're negative, they push you away. When they're positive, they pull you in. It's like reversing the magnet. The positive affinities, they naturally, you took both ends and then boom, they go apart. So affinities here would be, I assume in your mean, positive. Sometimes this is attributed in the text of what they call shangan, good roots. In other words, in this life or in previous lives, for all sorts of reasons and conditions, you cultivated, had a flavor, had a taste of good friends in the Dharma, these teachings, the joys that come from contemplative practice and a liberated conscience and so forth. And it was part almost of your genetic makeup. I'm using this as a parallel. But it's a carried along proclivity or tendency that they use the agricultural good roots. It's like the roots are good. So when they're planted, immediately it picks up on that which is healthy and wholesome and it flowers. Without those good roots, you have to do a lot of doctoring to get a plant going. So you're coming in with, and the thing about good roots, they don't have to be thought about. They don't have to be even necessarily understood. They're just this tendency you have. And you can't explain it. You maybe walk into a monastery or walk into, you see a Buddha image or something like this, and you just feel really at ease, really at home, settled, good roots. And you meet a monk or a nun, or you meet an instructor, or you encounter a sutra text, and you just say, wow, that makes so much sense. Yeah, got it, really. And gosh, that seems like my brother or sister or something. I have these affinities, you call it. These are natural. And they're very important because when you cultivate them, they help you choose your path without choosing. This is critical because if you start doing cultivation on a cost-benefit analysis, you'll never get past first base. The real pull or push, you want to say, the attraction, if you want to use affinities, coming from these natural tendencies cultivated over time, are very powerful and get you past your obstacles of thinking, of weighing, trying to decide. You're almost leaning in that direction, and all it takes is a little, and you're already in the door. So I think understanding why good roots are important, and we could spend lectures on how to cultivate good roots. But once, for example, good roots have to do with moral behavior. If you cultivate moral sensibility, moral balance, life after life, the inclination you have to hurt, to harm yourself and others is almost absent, or it's so small that when the when the temptation arises, you have no attraction to it whatsoever. You know what I mean? It's not like it's even a temptation. Those are good roots. It's not even something, it's intuitive, it's in the belly. You don't have to think about it. And these are very strong because they are more powerful than will and intention. These are will and intention now deeply reified into your natural habitual tendencies. That's what Confucius meant when he said, when I was 15, I set my mind on the way, but not till 70 could I just follow my inclinations and be in accord with the way. This is that meaning. That word, that's good roots. Yeah, good question. I think I'll probably, given the time, devote next week to this whole idea of self, not self. Because it deserves more than a sort of gloss. It's one that's really misunderstood widely, not just among newcomers to Buddhism, but I would say, from my experience, even among Buddhists themselves, what this idea means. And if we don't get it clear, we don't understand it, it's very easy to go wrong in our practice. Because it's not just a philosophical concept, which it is, and we'll go into that, but it's also a way of cultivating. So the use of non-self it's more of a dynamic practice. It's a way of untying knots, moment to moment, thought to thought, if you can understand what it is and use it, as well as being a teaching. But the reason why the teaching comes up in the first place is because it's intimately connected to the psychological tendency of clinging and attaching, which we were talking about tonight earlier. Clinging and attaching is behind the I-making or the self-making mechanism that we do, thought after thought, emotion after emotion. Most of our conscious and even our subconscious activity is this manufacturing of a sense of an I as some unstable, eternal, unchanging, autonomous monad that we concoct. I'm going to say concoct. There is no such thing as that. That doesn't stop us from concocting it. And that is part of the clinging behavior, the clinging mechanism that's at the heart of being an ordinary, uncultivated living being. This is this deep thirst and darkness of understanding, avidya, not seeing things clearly. The Buddha's teaching around this thing comes as an expedient device to stop the clinging, rather than to philosophically make some doctrinal statement or dogmatic statement. There is no self. That's not what it's about. It's actually a psychological, medicinal, prescriptive technique to break and interrupt the clinging behind the I-making. And if you can interrupt that, there's moments where something else can come forth, which is the awakened being as opposed to the self-being. So I don't want to do too much on it tonight. I think it's really worthy of pursuing a little more. And hopefully we can go into that next week. I do want to share, though, because I brought my Zhangzi with me. I like Zhangzi a lot. And I said I was going to share this passage. Once again, my feather from Maine as my marker. But the passage I read you to in the Lotus, difficult to understand, hard to conceive, living beings because of their desires, the grasping desires and delusions, are very, very difficult to teach. So this passage here is following the passage I read you last week from the Zhuangzi, where he was talking about how great understanding and small. He was comparing the little bird to the great pung bird, and basically we ended with this wonderful line. Let's see if I can find it here. Saying, thus there's a difference between big understanding and small understanding. Such is the difference between big and little. So the reason I like this too is what we're talking about here is the Buddha and living beings. The difference of big and little. You could use the same passage, living beings being little, xiao, xian, small-minded, and Buddha's being great expansive mind. Same mind, but either shrunk or expanded, collapsed or full. So again, I like this big and small. And the Maha, Vaipulya Avatamsaka, the Greek, means expansive, awakened teachers, teaching sutra, and so forth. So this idea that you find in the drawings between big and small, where he uses these wonderful analogies between the quail and the great pung bird, or the mouse and the lion and so forth, is big and small, is talking not about kind of physicality, but rather mental and emotional states of being. So here's the passage where I think matches or parallels with great understanding is compassionate and wise and expansive. Small understanding is grasping, attaching, and self-centered. So here's the Zhuangzi. Great understanding is broad and unhurried. I really like that. Little understanding is cramped and busy. Great words are clear and limpid. Little words are shrill and quarrelsome. In sleep, men's spirits go visiting. In waking hours, their bodies hustle. With everything they meet, they become entangled. My teacher used to use a word, we're like Velcro. And we just stick to everything we be. Day after day, they use their minds in strife, sometimes grandiose, sometimes sly, sometimes petty. Their little fears are mean and trembly. Their great fears are stunned and overwhelming. They bound off like an arrow or a crossbow pellet, certain that they are arbiters of right and wrong. This is good. They cling to their positions as though they had sworn before the gods, sure that they are holding on to victory. They fade like fall in winter. Such is the way they dwindle day by day. They drown in what they do. This is just a beautiful line. They drown in what we do. Yeah. What is fish swim in the water? People swim about and muck in the world is a Chan verse. It's the same sort of thing. We think we're swimming, we're getting along, but what we're doing often is drowning in what we do, our careers, our ambitions, our aspirations, the things we acquire and buy, the emotions that we build up, that we are so eager to have. It's a kind of drowning, a kind of losing of our breath. They drown in what they do, and here's the line, you cannot make them turn back. This is the Zhuangzi. The Buddha is saying this is hard, it's difficult to get them to do this. They grow dark as though sealed with seals. Such are the excesses of their old age. And when their minds draw near to death, nothing can restore them to light. Joy, anger, grief, delight, worry, regret, fickleness, inflexibility, willfulness, candor, insolence, and so on, and the text goes. It's just a beautiful passage. Now, of course, Zhuangzi doesn't end on this sour note, but he's just saying the small mind of the people that don't open their hearts and don't open their minds to expand and grow end up, even though they think they're right, even though they think they've accomplished, even though they think they're the masters of the world, in that pettiness of ambition and accomplishment, they are literally drowning in their own fumes and their own waves that they stir up. And you find the similar passage here, and it's almost as if on top of the compassion comes this understanding of the unwillingness to. And so the Buddha's bodhisattvas say, the sages and the Zhuangzi, look for means to break through the unwillingness as the first step. Because without breaking through that, you can't get to the second one of the teaching and instructing. And so whatever means they come up with, and there's many, many stories about using this, but I would say this is the first challenge of the sage. And perhaps the first challenge in my own cultivation, if I think about it, when was that moment that I gave up my stubborn unwillingness? And during this last bowing retreat, I told the story. For me, it was my first encounter with my teacher, who pointed out my arrogance, my sense that I had nothing further to learn, that I was accomplished. And him knowing me better than I knew myself and pointing out that flaw changed my unwillingness to almost like a childlike willingness to be taught and to be transformed that wasn't there before. That was an expedient mean used for me that evening. But without that, I might be still clinging to my unwillingness and calling it mastery, calling it the accomplished me, but literally spiritually drowning. So to be able to spot where that place of unwillingness is and to chip away at it, or to have a heart to at least be willing to soften it a bit, really is at the heart of the Bodhi resolve, I feel. The Bodhi resolve comes forth naturally when the stubborn unwillingness is melted a bit. I'll stop there. Next week we'll go into the to the self and more about that. And I think Jin Chuan is going to talk tonight. Should we turn this mic? Here, turn it like this. Okay.
That camera? Well, I was listening to Marty speak, especially at the very end, about stubborn unwillingness. And I was reflecting on myself, reflecting on kind of what were the moments when my stubbornness kind of relaxed a little bit. And one moment came to mind in particular. I remember when I began learning Buddhism, being very inspired by the principles, thinking, this is so wonderful. A path to freedom and happiness. And I was actually pretty rejecting of, you could say, worldly values and material success. And I remember my parents, can you hear? I'm pretty loud.
Yeah, you have to talk louder.
Talk louder with the, I don't know, let me take off the mask briefly. So
Pull that closer.
yeah, I can pull it closer.
You don't want to put that around your neck, or you?
Okay, so Marty would just finish the lecture on this sense of stubborn unwillingness. And so I was just reflecting on myself, thinking, when was I stubbornly unwilling? Happens quite a bit, but I was just reflecting back when I started learning Buddhism and being very inspired. A path to freedom and liberation. And I was rejecting many of the worldly values that I grew up with, the kind of competitive Silicon Valley pursuit of material success. And in that process, you could say, really was rejecting of my parents' values, because I felt that their way of approaching the world was not in alignment with what I thought I wanted to do. I've told this story before, but it's what came to mind when it comes to stubborn unwillingness. Well, I remember I was putting kind of full effort into wanting to pursue the spiritual life. Not really in a balanced way. I'll say this came from, interesting enough, a stubborn narrowness that I was right and this is the path I want to walk on and don't tell me anything else. And so it's interesting because I remember that time learning the Dharma being pretty extreme and kind of getting myself in a little corner But I was unwilling to really consider anything else because I felt, this is what I had to do. And I remember at one point, I came and spoke with Monk Heng Sure about what I was to do with my life. And his response to me was very, very surprising. He told me I was supposed to listen to my mom more. And I remember looking at Monk Heng Sure and thinking, what? That makes no sense, because my mom doesn't want me to do what I'm doing now, and this is what I want to do. This doesn't make any sense. But his response was, you would say, unexpected enough that it caused me to reflect a little bit about what I was doing. Maybe you could say there was a little bit of willingness to learn from Monk Heng Sure because he was a senior monk, someone who has actually walked the path. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll give this a try. Maybe I'll try to listen to my mom a little bit more, learn how to be a good son. I remember picking up the book that we have here in the monastery about how to be a good child, called Standards for Students. And I picked up the book. I remember reading the first verse. A lot of people know the first verse. It says something like, when your parents call, immediately respond. So wow, that's not so easy. So I tried it. And I think the second one, when their parents scold you, listen patiently. I was like, wow, that's also not so easy. But it was actually interesting because although it was so uncomfortable, it was essentially, I had to let go of that kind of rightness and tightness and kind of confidence that was built on a kind of pride. It was not real confidence, but a kind of a false sense of, we talked about self, about being right. I had to kind of slowly let that go. If I was trying to reflect on the inner experience of that, it was kind of different parts of my mind and my heart began to open up again. It was uncomfortable because I had to give up some things that I had invested so much of my energy in. But in the process of letting go of that, I found that I had a much deeper connection with my parents, a much more gratitude for what I have received rather than pushing them away and thinking that I was right. Interesting enough, and actually a kind of the sutras even opened up more. Because I realized before I was reading the sutras and the text for what I wanted to read. I was reading it, this kind of very extreme way. And I would completely miss Master Hua's humor, Master Hua's kind of sensitivity, and just read his most extreme passages and kind of a kind of fundamentalist mindset. And I remember thinking to myself, how come I missed this before? Was this always here before? And I realized actually it was. It was just that my mind had become so tight around one way of seeing the world that I wasn't open to it. So maybe I'll just finish with that. As Marty mentioned about the people who walked out of the Lotus Sutra. And I think in the Lotus Sutra that kind of tightness of mind, that kind of pride is actually potentially the biggest obstacle on the spiritual path. Because what happens is that it's not that the Buddha Dharma isn't profound, it's that we limit ourselves because of what we think we know. And so one reflection I have now that I found very helpful is, actually comes from the Yogacara, is that we're limited already by our six senses. So we're not picking up what's really going on for sure, because our senses are already limited. And then from there, we're interpreting everything through our sense of self, what makes sense to me. So again, we shrink our experience. And another level, we interpret everything through our past memories and experiences. So again, our experiences shrinks. So how could what we be experiencing be the totality of reality? It's just not possible. So I find that's a helpful reflection for me, just to stay relaxed, stay open, be really grateful for whatever arises, and maybe I just end it there, in the sense that I think we've all had the experience of when we're really stubborn and unwilling to learn because we want to be right. And still myself, I do that quite a bit. But I find that the fastest way to kind of find inner balance is just relaxing the body, and just reflecting, you know what, I'd rather be connected to people rather than being right. So maybe I'll just say that much. Yeah?
Any announcements?
Announcements. We have pretty much our regular schedule. Tomorrow we won't be having our Dharma reflection in the morning and 3 steps, 1 bow, because we'll be traveling to River Vihara. Otherwise, it's the same schedule. Tomorrow we have Verhoeven Heng Sure lecture. Yeah. Sunday, Verhoeven Heng Sure will having an interview, like a dialogue with Nipun, Sunday evening. I think beginning at 7:30 p.m. Hosted by Dr. Raymond Ye. I think something about maybe finding your meaning in life or something, right? So it's some topic like that. So it should be interesting. Verhoeven Heng Sure and Nipun are interesting. They have a lot of insights together. They're a good team. Anything else I'm missing? I think that's it, yeah? Oh, you have a question? Can you ask a question? For me? For Marty? What after? 我们现在还在网上 Afterwards. Okay, we can finish.
Okay.
So let's do a dedication of merit. Willingness to understand, yeah. No, I've been very inspired by the men training here, and willingness to understand. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the Venerable Master. Okay, wish everyone good evening.